Hello, I am Fergus Donahoe, an editor of the Chess Variant pages, the inventor of several different chess variants, and the creator of Game Courier, which lets you play chess and other chess variants against other people online. In this video, I am going to introduce you to the game of chess and explain how it is played. Chess is an abstract strategy board game played on an 8x8 checkered board. It consists of 8 files and 8 ranks, a file being a vertical column and a rank being a horizontal row. Each player begins with 16 pieces of the same color, and the game begins in the position shown. Here we have the pawns on the second rank of each player. In the corners we have the rooks. Note that when you're setting up the board, a light colored corner should be on your right side. Then we have the knights next to the rooks. We have the bishops next to the knights. We have a king and a queen. The queen appears on the D column, the king appears on the E column. And note that when you're setting up the queen, remember the queen goes on her own color. So the white queen goes on the light square, and the black queen goes on the dark square. White moves first and play alternates between each side. The other player is normally called black, even though the pieces shown here are red. Each turn consists in moving a piece from its current space to another space. It may move to an empty space, like so, or it may move to a space occupied by an enemy piece, like so. And when it moves to an occupied space, it captures the piece already on this space, removing it from the game. Each piece moves according to its own powers of movement, which I shall now describe. These pieces are collectively known as riders. A rider can move any number of empty spaces in the same direction until it is blocked by another piece. If the blocking piece belongs to the opponent, a rider may move to its space and capture it. It must otherwise stop before reaching the occupied space. The riders in chess are distinguished by the directions they can move. A rook can move to any orthogonal direction. This is movement through the sides of spaces. On the chessboard, this is vertically along its file or horizontally along its rank. A bishop can move in any diagonal direction. This is movement through the corners of spaces. All diagonal movement is to spaces of the same color, so each bishop is color bound. One bishop can go on only light colored spaces, and the other can go on only dark spaces. The queen is a compound of the rook and the bishop. This means it can move as either piece, orthogonally or diagonally. Note that the movement of any rider can be blocked. Let's say I move this here. This queen now blocks the movement of the black queen and one of the black bishops. Each may capture it, but neither may move past it. Say the bishop takes the queen and the rook moves up here. Now that the bishop has captured it, the bishop blocks the queen, as you can see here. The queen cannot capture or move past the bishop. Note that the rook cannot move past the enemy rook on the 5th rank, though it may capture it. These pieces are collectively known as leapers. A leaper moves directly to its destination, leaping over any intervening spaces. Even when those spaces are occupied, a leaper can never be blocked. The king can leap to any adjacent space, one space diagonally or orthogonally. It doesn't leap over any spaces, but that's only because its leap is too short for that to be necessary. Let me move this here and back up. Move this here and make sure I'm playing both sides. The king's leap always takes it to the first perimeter, which is the ring of spaces one space away from it. Because it is the object of the game to checkmate the king, which means to attack it and leave it no escape from capture, the king may not legally move into check, which is to move to a space from which it could be captured. So let me move these closer to each other, and I'll show you an example of that. Now here, the black king cannot move here, here, or here, because if it did, the white king could capture it. That would be moving into check, which is illegal. Let's back up here. The knight can leap to any space at the opposite corner of a 2x3 rectangle. So here's a 2x3 rectangle. And here's one corner of it, here's the other corner. Likewise, here's another, here's one corner, here's another corner. Let's move this here and this here. Its leap takes it to the second perimeter, which is the ring of spaces 2 spaces away, but only to the spaces in the second perimeter whose color is different than the color of its current space. So you'll see here that this knight is on a dark space, and it can only leap to light colored spaces. I'll move this one here. And this knight, which is on a light space, can only leap to dark colored spaces. Let's move that here. I have now surrounded the knight with extra pieces. Because the knight is leaping to its destination rather than passing through spaces, it cannot be blocked. Even when surrounded, it can still reach its destination. There is one special move in chess involving the king and rook, which lets it move 2 pieces at once. This is called castling. When castling, the king moves 2 spaces toward the rook, and the rook moves to the other side of the king. Here I just showed you an example of queenside castling. Here's an example of kingside castling. Back up here. Here's an example of kingside castling for white. Here's an example of queenside castling for black. Castling on this side is called queenside because this is the queen side of the board. Over here is the king side of the board, so castling over here is called kingside. Now the ability to castle is subject to some restrictions. One restriction is that if there's a piece in between the king and the rook, if there are any pieces on any of the spaces between the king and the rook, they cannot castle. So here, for example, the king cannot castle with this rook because the bishop is in the way, though it still can castle over here. Now let's move this here. And another restriction is that the king may not castle into check. On this space here, the king would be in check from the bishop, so he cannot castle there. So let's castle over here. And notice now that this rook is bearing down on this file. And if the king were to move here, it would be in check. So since the king cannot castle through check, it cannot castle with the rook on the queen side. Let's now move back and move the bishop up here, checking the king. And now the king is unable to castle at all because a king cannot castle out of check. So we'll move here instead. And let's move the bishop down here where it's not attacking anything or getting in the way. And note that the king can no longer castle. Once the king has moved, it cannot castle, and so if the king is on any space other than its original space, it cannot castle. Let's note that even if it goes back to its original space, it will not be able to castle. Here there's nothing stopping it from castling except that it has already moved. These spaces are not in check. King is not in check. The rooks have not moved. Which brings me to the next thing here. If the rook moves, you cannot castle. But before I do that, let's go back to where the king could castle and get rid of that bishop. Okay. So the king can castle here. If the rook moves, and let's say move that rook too, now the king cannot castle with that rook. For one thing, the rook is not in its original space, but let's say it moves back. Even so, the king cannot castle with it because the king cannot castle with a rook that has moved. Castling is allowed only when neither the king nor the rook have moved. It doesn't matter if they have moved back to the original space. As long as they've moved, they can't castle. But the king can still castle with this rook, which has not moved. Here are the pawns. Each player begins with a row of pawns on the second rank. Unlike other pieces, the pawn can only move forward. The pawn normally moves 1 space vertically forward, but on its first move, it may move 2 spaces vertically forward. So let's move this here and this here. Now that the pawn has moved, it may now move only one space forward, like so. The same goes for the pawn that black has moved. It can only move there, but I'll back up. Note that the black pawn at e7, it has only one move. It could not move here to capture this pawn because the vertical moves of the pawn cannot be used for capturing. The pawn captures diagonally. I've made a few moves, and as shown here, this pawn can capture this pawn or this pawn by its diagonal move. But this pawn here is not allowed to move because it cannot capture vertically forward. It can only capture diagonally forward. When a pawn makes a double move that places it next to an enemy pawn on the same rank, that pawn may use its very next turn to capture the pawn by a move called en passant, which is French for in passing. Note that en passant works as though the pawn had moved one space and the pawn captures it normally. Let me do the en passant again. Back up. Okay. Before doing en passant, let me do some other moves. And now en passant cannot be done because en passant is available only on the turn immediately following the double move of the pawn. If any moves intervene, en passant is not allowed. Since the pawn can only move forward, once it reaches the back rank, it can no longer move, but it can promote. It can promote to any piece except the king or another pawn, so it can promote to a bishop, a knight, a queen, or a rook. Most commonly it promotes to a queen, which is the most powerful piece in the game. The object of chess is to checkmate the enemy king, which is to check the king in a way that it cannot escape check. That is to leave it no escape. Let me illustrate this with a fool's mate example, which is a very quick way to checkmate the king. And I need to play both sides. So here the white king is in check from the black queen, and he has no place to go. Most of the spaces neighboring the king are blocked. This space is not blocked, but it's still also attacked by the queen. If white could move a piece here or here, he would block the check, but white has no piece. He can move to either of those spaces. And white has no piece with which to capture the queen, so this is checkmate. A game of chess is drawn when a player has no legal moves. This is called stalemate, and this is one way in which the game of chess can be drawn. Here, black has no legal moves because of the position on the board. If black's king moved here or here, it would be in check. It can't move here or here because it's blocked. The movement of this rook is blocked. The movement of the pawn is blocked. And this rook here is pinned by this bishop. If it were to move, it would leave the king in check from this bishop here. So black has no legal move. This is stalemate, and it's a draw. Some other draw conditions of chess are that if the same position is repeated 3 times, the game can be declared a draw, or if 50 moves go by without moving a pawn or capturing a piece, the game can be declared a draw. The game can also end if one player chooses to resign. These are the rules of chess. If you want more details, you can go to our description of the rules on the chess variant pages. I'll include a link in the video. Thank you for watching. Bye.